The afternoon sun reflected off shop windows, the kind of small-town calm that hides how fast everything can change. At the crosswalk stood Daniel Cole, 61, wearing a worn Marine Corps jacket and dark glasses. One hand held a white cane, the other gripped the harness of his German Shepherd Ranger. To most, he looked like another old veteran taking a slow walk downtown. To anyone who knew his past, he was a legend, a sniper-turned-hero, now blind but never broken. Before we start this story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Also, please subscribe to the channel. It will help us to bring you more inspiring stories every day. Across the street, Maya Turner, a freelance journalist, adjusted her camera lens. She'd been filming a short documentary about kindness in small towns. She didn't know that within minutes she'd capture something the world would never forget. The sound came first, shouting. Two officers approached Dan, barking orders. Someone had reported a dangerous man with an attack dog. Dan turned toward the voices, confused. "Officer, I can't see you," he said calmly. "He's my service dog." But fear doesn't wait for truth. A taser crackled. The jolt hit first. Ranger yelped, his body collapsing onto the asphalt. Dan screamed, not in pain, but in panic. "Ranger, he's my partner." His knees buckled as the current hit him next. The white cane clattered to the ground. The crowd gasped. Children cried. A woman shouted, "He's blind!" But the officers' voices kept cutting through the chaos, sharp and defensive. "Stay down!" From the edge of the street, Maya's camera kept rolling, her hands shaking so violently she could barely focus. She zoomed in on Ranger, twitching, whimpering, then on Dan, trembling as he reached blindly for his fallen friend. "Help him!" someone screamed. No one moved. The police shouted about protocol, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Maya's heart hammered as she whispered to herself, "Oh my God, what are they doing?" And then the entire scene froze in a single frame. A decorated war hero lying helpless beside his service dog in the middle of a public street, surrounded by flashing lights. 10 minutes later, the video hit social media. Maya hadn't meant for it to explode. She just wanted someone to help. But once it uploaded, there was no stopping it. Within minutes, comments poured in. "That's Sergeant Cole. He's a hero." "They tased a blind veteran." "Where's justice for Ranger?" The hashtag started trending. Jacques Justice for Ranger and Jacques Honor the Blind Vet. Veterans groups began sharing it. Motorcycle clubs reposted it with captions like, "Real heroes don't wear badges. They wear scars." Maya's phone buzzed non-stop. A local radio host called for interviews. News outlets begged for the footage. She refused. "This isn't mine," she said softly. "It's his story." But the one message that mattered most didn't come from a journalist. It came from a private network, a secure veteran channel. A name popped up on her screen. Briggs, Retute 3rd Recon. The message was short. "He saved my life once. We're on our way." Back at the scene, chaos still ruled. The police had cordoned off the area, trying to control the narrative. "Suspect resisted commands," one officer muttered to a reporter. Maya stood nearby, her camera lowered but still recording. Her jaw tightened. "You mean the blind man who didn't see your commands?" she said. Silence. A nurse from the crowd knelt beside Dan and checked Ranger's pulse. "He's breathing," she whispered. Dan exhaled with a shaking sob, pressing his forehead against the dog's side. "Hang on, boy." "You always do." Then came the rumble, distant, low, powerful. At first no one noticed. The crowd assumed it was traffic, but Maya's instincts told her otherwise. She lifted her camera again, scanning the horizon. The noise grew louder, deeper, unified. Not cars, not trucks, engines, dozens of them. The ground itself seemed to vibrate as black motorcycles crested the far hill, chrome flashing in the sun. On every leather vest glinted the same emblem, The skull and wings of the hellsangels. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the bikers closed in, engines thundering like an oncoming storm. They didn't stop at the lights or the barriers. They surrounded the block in perfect formation, a moving wall of chrome, leather, and silent fury. The officers froze. Maya's camera trembled as she captured the moment that would define her career. The lead rider killed his engine and dismounted. A tall, broad man with grey in his beard and a heavy cut reading Briggs, HA Veteran Chapter. He walked straight through the police tape, his boots crunching glass and gravel, and stopped beside Dan. "You're safe now, brother," he said quietly. Then he turned to the officers. His voice carried over the roar of idling bikes. "You just tased a Medal of Valor recipient and his service dog. From this moment on, this road belongs to us until he gets justice." No one dared move. Even the sirens seemed to fall silent. And in that silence the world realized this wasn't revenge. It was respect, loyalty, and brotherhood, answering a call the system had ignored. The sound of rumbling engines echoed through downtown, the kind of sound that made people step back without knowing why. But there was no threat in the air, only purpose. The Hells Angels Veteran Chapter didn't arrive to start a fight. They came to protect one of their own. The leader, Briggs, removed his helmet and knelt beside Sergeant Cole. "You remember me, don't you, brother?" he said softly. Dan's head tilted toward the voice. A faint smile broke through the pain. "Briggs, Afghanistan. And Convoy Run 2006. Briggs nodded once. "That's right. You pulled me out of the wreckage. Now it's our turn." The officers tried to regain control. "You can't block a public road," one said, voice shaky. Briggs rose slowly, his eyes cold but calm. "You tased a blind Marine and his canine partner in front of children. You lost the right to give orders today." Behind him, 50 riders stood silent, veterans, mechanics, fathers, each one a wall of leather and resolve. The crowd, once fearful, began to clap. Maya captured everything. Every second, every expression, every tremor of emotion. Her live stream was already at 2 million views. The comments scrolled faster than she could read. The angels came for him. "Real heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. This restores my faith in humanity." But not everyone cheered. The police chief arrived on scene, his voice loud and forced. "Disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for obstruction." Briggs didn't flinch. "Then you'll need to arrest all of us. Every man here has served this country longer than you've worn that badge." The chief hesitated, realizing how badly the optics had already turned. News cameras arrived. Reporters swarmed. Helicopters circled above. Maya zoomed in on Dan, still clutching Ranger's paw. She whispered into her mic, "If this is what justice looks like now, then maybe the angels are the only ones left guarding it." Minutes later, an ambulance finally broke through the barricade. The bikers parted, clearing a path. Briggs tapped the medic's shoulder. "You move him first, then the dog." The medic nodded quickly, sensing the weight of command. Dan's voice trembled as he whispered, "Don't leave him, please." The medic smiled gently. "We won't, Sergeant. He's riding with you." Ranger whimpered faintly as they lifted him onto a stretcher beside his handler. The crowd applauded as the pair were wheeled into the ambulance, still connected by a single leash. Maya followed close behind, documenting every detail. As the ambulance doors closed, Briggs turned back to his men. "Nobody leaves. Nobody touches a cop. We stand here until the truth is told." He raised a gloved fist. "For the Brotherhood!" Dozens of fists rose behind him, a sea of black leather and silent power. 2 hours later, the hospital parking lot looked like a fortress. Rows of bikes lined the entrance, their chrome glinting under the setting sun. Nurses and doctors watched in awe as men who once fought in deserts and jungles stood guard now over one of their own. Maya moved through the crowd, still filming. Inside, Dan lay motionless, hooked to monitors. The taser burns on his back were red and angry, but he was stable. Ranger, bandaged and resting beside the bed, lifted his head when Maya entered. She placed her camera down and whispered, "The world's watching, Sergeant." "They know what happened," Dan smiled faintly. "Then maybe something good will come out of this." Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she looked at him, a blind man who'd never stopped seeing hope. By nightfall, every major network had arrived. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder outside the hospital gates, their cameras reflecting the glowing headlights of the biker convoy. On social media, millions demanded answers. Hellsangels for justice trended worldwide. At City Hall, the mayor held an emergency press conference. The actions taken against Sergeant Daniel Cole and his service animal were unacceptable, he said, voice trembling. Effective immediately, the involved officers are suspended pending investigation. The crowd outside erupted in cheers. Back at the hospital, Briggs received the news through his earpiece. He looked at the other riders and nodded. "You see, brothers? We didn't need violence. Just presence." He turned to Maya. "You did your part too. The world needed eyes today, and yours saw truth." Maya swallowed hard, realizing she hadn't just reported a story. She'd witnessed a movement, one built not on anger, but on honor. Morning light poured through the hospital blinds. Sergeant Dan stirred, his fingers brushing against fur. Ranger's head rested beside his arm, eyes half open, bandaged but alive. Dan smiled weakly. "Still here, huh?" The dog's tail thumped once against the blanket. Outside the door, Briggs stood silently. He'd stayed all night, his leather cut still dusted with road grime, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier on watch. When Dan finally woke fully, Briggs entered quietly. "You always did make things dramatic, brother," he said with a faint grin. Dan chuckled, his voice raspy. "Couldn't let you boys forget me." They both laughed softly, the sound breaking the heaviness that hung in the air. Maya recorded from a respectful distance. There was no interview, no performance. Just two men who'd fought the same wars, carrying the same scars. For the first time, the world wasn't watching bikers as outlaws. They were seeing what they really were. Guardians in denim and chrome. Outside, the hospital parking lot had turned into something sacred. Dozens of people arrived with flowers, flags, and handwritten letters for Dan and Ranger. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder beside Hell's Angels, united by shared code. No cameras, no speeches, just quiet respect. One little boy, no older than 10, approached Briggs nervously with a folded flag in his hands. "My dad's a Marine," he said shyly. "He said to give this to Sergeant Cole." Briggs knelt down, accepting it like it was gold. "Your dad raised a good man," he said, his voice thick. When Maya interviewed the boy later, his words broke millions of hearts. "I thought bikers were scary, but they're the good guys." That clip alone reached 30 million views overnight. Across the country, Harley clubs, veteran chapters and citizens rode out in solidarity, engines roaring not for rebellion, but remembrance. A movement had begun. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Reporters lined the walls, their lenses glinting under fluorescent light. Dan sat quietly in the front row, Ranger resting at his feet. Briggs and a few angels flanked the back, their presence calm but commanding. When the video from that day played, the taser, the screams, the collapse, you could hear a pin drop. Even the judge's voice trembled as he spoke. "This nation honors men like you, Sergeant Cole. Today, it's our turn to defend you." The verdict was swift. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, their badges revoked. The city issued a formal apology, and a policy was passed. Every officer would now undergo mandatory disability awareness and veteran training. Dan didn't ask for money or headlines or revenge. He asked for one thing: that no blind veteran ever faced that kind of fear again. After the verdict, the hellsangels organized something the town would never forget. The Ride for Ranger. Thousands of bikers gathered from across the state, their engines harmonizing like thunder rolling across the plains. Maya stood by the roadside, filming as Dan and Ranger were escorted in a sidecar wrapped in the American flag. Crowds cheered, waving signs that read, "Honor our veterans" and "Angels among us." As they rode through downtown, people lined rooftops and balconies, tossing red and white flowers onto the passing convoy. Briggs led the formation, his voice coming through the comms. "We ride for the ones who can't. We stand for the ones who served." Dan raised his hand in salute. Ranger barked once, tail wagging. It was more than a ride. It was redemption roaring down asphalt. When the engines finally fell silent, Dan stood at the town's central memorial. The mayor unveiled a bronze plaque that read, "For Sergeant Daniel Cole and Ranger, a bond that never broke, a brotherhood that never faded." Dan placed his hand on the cool metal and smiled through tears. "This isn't just for me," he said quietly. "It's for every man who thought the world forgot him." Ranger leaned against his leg, eyes bright, proud. Maya closed her camera, unable to see through her own tears. She whispered to Briggs, "You didn't just block a road that day. You changed one." He nodded. "We don't do it for headlines," he said softly. "We do it because loyalty doesn't end when the war does." As the sun set behind the rows of bikes, their chrome reflecting orange firelight, a simple truth settled over everyone there. Sometimes the real angels ride on two wheels. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that day never faded. Across the country, murals began appearing. Sergeant Cole and Ranger side by side, painted beneath the words, "They served twice." Veterans called the hospital just to thank them. Families of disabled soldiers sent letters, each one sharing how the video gave them courage to step outside again. And through it all, Maya worked quietly, turning her footage into something bigger, a documentary titled Angels on Asphalt. At the film's private screening, the front row was filled with black leather vests. Briggs sat beside Dan, both men motionless as their story filled the screen, not a story of revenge, but redemption. When the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Maya stood before them, voice trembling. "I thought I was filming an injustice," she said. "But what I captured was faith. Faith that good men still stand when others fall." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Even Ranger barked once, as if to say amen. That same week, the local police department, under new leadership, invited Dan to speak at a training seminar. Some officers shifted uncomfortably as the blind veteran took the podium. But his words weren't angry. They were calm, steady, and human. "I don't hate you," he said. "I just want you to see, really see, the people you serve." He placed his hand over Ranger's head. "Because this dog, he saw when you didn't." When he finished, silence filled the hall. Then one officer, barely out of training, stood and saluted. Others followed. It was the beginning of change, not in law but in hearts. Outside, Briggs waited beside his Harley. "Never thought I'd see you giving speeches, Sergeant." Dan grinned. "Never thought I'd have an audience full of cops." They laughed together, the tension between two worlds melting into respect. The brotherhood had done what politics couldn't. It built understanding. Spring arrived, and the air carried the low hum of engines again. But this time, it wasn't a protest. It was a celebration. The angels rode to the Veterans Memorial Park, where a new monument was being unveiled. Maya stood beside them with her camera ready, capturing the moment for the world. The mayor stepped up to the mic. "Today, we dedicate this space not just to one man or one dog, but to what they represent: loyalty, courage, and compassion. He pulled the cloth away, revealing a bronze statue of Dan and Ranger standing side by side. Dan reached out, his fingertips tracing the cool metal of Ranger's ears. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "We made it." The crowd erupted in applause. The angels revved their bikes in salute, their engines harmonizing into one proud roar. It wasn't noise. It was a hymn. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Maya found herself at a quiet diner on the edge of town, the same one she'd stopped at the day before it all happened. Dan joined her, wearing his leather vest gifted by the angels. It read Honorary Member, H.A. Vets Chapter. He laughed softly when she pointed at it. "Guess I finally joined a gang," he said, half joking. She smiled. "Not a gang, Sergeant. A family." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of passing bikes filling the background. "You know," Maya said, stirring her coffee, "the world thinks of them as outlaws. But I saw something different," Dan nodded. "People fear what they don't understand. But sometimes the people they fear are the ones keeping them safe." Months later, a soft breeze carried the sound of distant engines through the cemetery grounds. A small gathering stood by a new memorial stone, in honor of all who served, on the battlefield and on the blacktop. Briggs placed his hand on the stone, eyes closed. Maya filmed quietly as Ranger lay beside Dan's chair, his head resting on his paw. A bugle played in the distance. No words were spoken, none were needed. As the camera panned up, the angels mounted their bikes and rode off into the golden horizon, engines rumbling low and steady. Maya's narration closed the film. They call them outlaws. But when the world turns its back on the broken, it's these men who show up, engines loud, hearts louder. Because brotherhood isn't about blood or leather, it's about never letting someone fall alone. The screen faded to black. The final image lingered, Dan and Ranger beneath the words, "Not all angels have wings." Zambride, if this story touched your heart, hit that like button, share it, and tell us, have you ever seen kindness in the unlikeliest place? Because sometimes heroes wear leather instead of badges.